The house quietly filled with evening shadows when Jason appeared on the threshold, drawing the attention of the entire family. He was my adoptive brother, and we had grown up together, always together, like real siblings. But now, standing before me was someone different, tanned, grown up, with a calm confidence that subtly held one's gaze. He hugged me firmly and like family, yet I felt that behind this familiar gesture was something new, indistinct. His gaze slid over me, lingered for a moment, studying as if he too was trying to understand what had changed in us over time. My heart clenched for a moment. The evening felt serene. Around the table there was light laughter, conversations interwoven, but at some point I caught myself secretly watching Jason. Mark, my boyfriend, sat beside me, cheerfully chatting with my parents, but it was hard for me to focus on the usual atmosphere. It was as if a new elusive shade had appeared in our relationship, a feeling unsaid, something no one dared to speak aloud. When the evening ended, I went up to my room but lingered in the dark hallway. At that moment, a simple thought struck me. Jason had returned, but not as a brother, as something unknown that awakened strange, troubling anticipation in me. The quiet night fell over the house and I couldn't sleep. Lulled by the silence, I lay with open eyes, listening to the soft sounds outside the window. Deciding to go to the kitchen for water, I threw on a semi-transparent nightgown, convinced that I wouldn't run into anyone at this hour. Barefoot on the cold floor, I felt a strange, almost childlike sense of freedom, as though I were alone here, hidden from the world. I entered the kitchen and froze. There, in the half-light, leaning against the counter, stood Jason. He looked as though he knew I would come. His eyes lingered on me longer than necessary, with a curiosity I hadn't expected. It seemed he didn't hurry to look away, and I didn't know where to hide under his attentive gaze. My nightgown, light and semi-transparent, suddenly felt nearly invisible, and a strange warmth spread inside. Couldn't sleep? His voice was quiet, calm, with a barely noticeable smile on his lips, but his gaze? It was entirely different, insistent, warm, too personal. "Yes, I just wanted some water," I replied, trying to keep a casual tone, but my voice betrayed me, sounding shaky and softer than I intended. I took a glass, and our eyes met again as if this silence belonged to only us. He didn't look away, and I felt a wave of embarrassment sweep over me, but to my surprise, I liked it. There was something inexplicable in Jason's gaze, something that made my heart beat faster. I had known him all my life, but now he stood before me as a different person, awakening feelings in me that shouldn't have been there. Awkwardly adjusting my nightgown, hoping it would ease the tension between us even slightly, I turned away, feeling his gaze on my back. For a few long moments, he said nothing, then simply smiled and slowly headed out, leaving with a calm, "Good night." When he left, I stood alone in the darkness, with flushed cheeks and a racing heart. It was just a glance, just silence in an empty kitchen, yet somehow that accidental encounter was so significant. Going back to my room, I felt a vague excitement, as if all of this were the beginning of something I couldn't yet name. From the very morning, Mark sensed something was off with me. His gaze grew more attentive, his movements more insistent, and it seemed like he was trying to find me behind an invisible wall I had built myself. I knew he would notice my changes. He always did. But how could I explain to him what was happening to me when I myself still didn't understand these vague, unsettling feelings? We were sitting in a small cafe near his work, clinging to a conversation about the weekend. He gently took my hand, looking at me with familiar kindness, and asked, "You seem a bit distant lately. Is everything okay?" I felt a growing urge to run from that question, but keeping calm, answered, "Everything's fine, Mark. It's just that Jason returned, and I probably just need to get used to it. You know, we haven't seen each other in a long time." He nodded, but his gaze revealed uncertainty. Mark was sensitive and caring, and I saw how he was trying to understand me, yet something in me had locked up. My excuse sounded plausible, but only on the surface. The true reasons lay somewhere deeper, behind that moment in the kitchen when Jason's gaze stirred something in me that shouldn't have been. Trying to ease the atmosphere, Mark smiled and suggested we spend the evening together. We agreed to meet at his place, have a cozy night, and try to rekindle that warmth we'd always shared in our relationship. I wanted to believe it would work, that we could regain the closeness I was used to. But as evening approached and I was getting ready, I recalled my conversation with Jason. His words still echoed in my head. He mentioned that he wanted to watch a movie with me, the same one we used to watch as kids, staying up late in his room, whispering stories to each other and laughing at silly things. This detail sparked something within me, and to my surprise, I realized that I wanted to spend the evening with him instead. Sending Mark a message that maybe we could meet later, I made a choice I couldn't yet explain to myself. I stood at the door, ready to leave for Mark's, but something inside me hesitated. Jason's smile, his calm gaze, the way he mentioned our favorite movie, all of it unexpectedly tipped the scales of my doubt. Deep down, I justified it by saying I just wanted to spend time with a brother I hadn't seen in years. After all, what was the harm? We were simply going to watch an old movie together, like in childhood. When I knocked on his door, he opened it, and surprise mixed with slight joy reflected on his face. "I didn't think you'd come," he smiled, stepping aside so I could enter. "Well, we promised to watch this movie, remember?" I tried to sound casual, but my voice betrayed a slight tremble. In Jason's room, everything remained the same as before. Dim light, the familiar scent of his cologne, a cozy bed piled with pillows. We sat down side by side and he started the movie. In the darkness, his room felt like an isolated island, where only we and the memories we once shared existed. After a while, my phone vibrated with a message from Mark. "You chose to spend the evening with him, not me? Why?" Quickly, I put the phone away without reading it fully, feeling a painful sting inside. But it was too late. I had already made my choice, and that simple decision seemed to open a door to the unknown. Jason hugged me when a tense scene appeared on the screen, casually, yet I felt his hand lingering a bit longer than it should have. My heart beat faster. His warmth beside me, his touch, it all felt so natural and at the same time not quite brotherly. The entire world outside this room disappeared. I found myself thinking that I enjoyed being here more than with Mark. Leaning into Jason, I allowed myself to relax, closing my eyes to the growing tension and guilt. For that moment, it was all that mattered. The room was steeped in twilight, leaving us together in the shadows cast by the screen's soft light. I felt the space around us shrink, as if Jason was getting closer, nearly touching me. At some point, his hand accidentally brushed mine, and I felt a wave of warmth ripple through me. Nerves tautened, breathing quickened, and all that existed in that moment was his closeness, his gaze lingering on me a bit too long. Our faces were so close I could feel his breath, warm, uneven. His lips touched mine softly, almost tentatively. But behind that touch was something impossible to ignore. He hugged me, his hand resting on my waist, and I felt him drawing me to him, as if he was hesitant yet unable to stop. His fingers slowly tightened on my waist, his breathing grew heavier, and I felt his growing desire, which made me tremble, understanding that it had long passed acceptable boundaries. In that moment, I allowed myself to forget, to feel my heart racing with excitement and fear as my body responded to his touch. But when he held my waist tighter, something in my mind clicked. Reality caught up to me, and I abruptly pulled away. We both stayed silent, as if unable to believe what had just happened. His eyes, full of confusion, met mine, and I felt the weight of what we had allowed ourselves to do. Without a word, I stood up, feeling my legs wobble from uncertainty, and reached for the phone next to me. The screen was lit with dozens of missed notifications. Mark's name was at the top, several missed calls and a slew of messages. To my surprise, I realized I hadn't heard a single ring or vibration. I was too absorbed in the time with Jason, cut off from the outside world, forgetting everything, even Mark. My palms were sweaty, my heart skipped a beat. A wave of guilt and bewilderment washed over me. Unable to say anything, I quickly put the phone back in my pocket and, without looking back, returned to my room, knowing that what had happened couldn't simply be forgotten. The next morning, as soon as I woke up, I saw a message from Mark, and a pang of guilt pierced my chest. He had called me, texted, yet I hadn't responded. So absorbed was I by the moment with Jason. My fingers trembled slightly as I finally sent him a brief message. "Sorry, I didn't hear the calls. Can we meet today at the cafe?" After a few minutes, he responded, and from his short "okay," I could tell he wasn't in a good mood. Later, when I arrived at the designated spot, he was already there, leaning against the table and idly flipping through the menu. Sitting across from him, I tried to start the conversation, but his pensive gaze stopped me. "Julia," he broke the silence, looking straight into my eyes. "What's going on? It's like you're not even here. I don't recognize you." His words pricked me. I couldn't reveal the true reason for my distance. The thought of Jason and yesterday's kiss gnawed at me from within, but I didn't have the strength to confess. Taking a deep breath, I tried to calm the panic. "Sorry, I'm just a bit lost," I muttered, avoiding his gaze. "You know, Jason's return. It's brought back so many memories, so much has resurfaced. I just need a little time to get used to it." Mark nodded, but I could see that my words didn't ease his concern. His eyes held suspicion, his hands were clenched, as if he was holding himself back from saying more. "You didn't respond yesterday. I waited and—" "Were you with him?" he finally asked, looking at me with a hurt that was clear in every word. I nodded, feeling a fresh wave of guilt rise in my chest. Our meetings with Mark no longer brought me the joy they once did. My thoughts kept drifting back to Jason, to that fleeting closeness that made me feel alive. Mark pressed his lips together, and I sensed the growing tension between us. His distrust, his attempts to understand what was happening, only dragged me deeper into this internal conflict. The nights became a time when Jason and I crossed paths again and again. These were silent encounters, as if we both were waiting for something neither dared to break. We met in the kitchen, the living room, or the hallway when the house was cloaked in silence, and it seemed that the whole world had shrunk to these brief moments, leaving only us in the night's shadows. At first, our conversations were light, almost random, about childhood, funny moments we had long forgotten. But soon they became increasingly personal. In the silence under the dim light of a lamp, we shared thoughts we wouldn't dare discuss in the daytime. It was as though memories and feelings long hidden behind the bonds of family were stirring within us. We never spoke about the kiss. It was as if we had silently agreed never to bring it up again, though both of us remembered every detail of it. One night sitting beside him, I realized I couldn't look away. Seconds stretched longer than usual, and it seemed that my feelings for him were deeper than I was ready to admit. My insides churned, but I tried to convince myself that these were just emotions connected to his return. However, each time he touched me accidentally, when our gazes met for a moment too long, I felt myself losing control over what once seemed unshakable. Soon I started preparing for these encounters differently. I chose my underwear more carefully, selected soft, cozy sweaters or nightgowns that would emphasize comfort, but also look appealing. It seemed I did this simply to feel more comfortable, but deep down, I knew the reason was different. My parents, sensing something was different, even remarked once that I seemed to be paying more attention to my appearance at home. I brushed it off as a joke, but I knew that each evening now meant more to me than just another night. And returning to my room after these encounters, I would recall his gaze, his barely perceptible smiles again and again. We both pretended our meetings were simply reminiscences of the past, but I knew this was the beginning of something I could no longer control. At the family dinner, I tried to remain calm, but each time my eyes met Jason's, a storm rose within me. The room was filled with the light murmur of conversation, laughter, clinking dishes. Yet all of it seemed to blur into the background when I caught his gaze, warm, with a hidden tension. That tension filled the space between us, threading through the air. He smiled slightly, almost imperceptibly, but it was enough for me to feel myself sinking deeper into this feeling, which had become my secret world. My attempts to keep myself within the framework of regular conversation seemed futile. Every word he spoke carried a special meaning for me, and I, barely touching my food, focused intently on how he moved his fork, how he laughed, how he glanced across the table. It was a game we both played silently, without words, but each of us knew it had become our reality. At some point, I noticed that my parents observed our exchanged glances. Mom, smiling, said something like, How wonderful it is to see you and Jason so close again. It's visible even at dinner." I felt a blush creep over my cheeks, but I managed to hold myself back from a reaction that might have given me away. Jason responded calmly, just nodding, but in his eyes I saw something warm, barely noticeable, meant only for me. As the parents continued talking, I felt a growing desire to be near him, to spend time with him, not just at night. I could no longer deceive myself that this was simply a wish to be closer to someone with whom I had grown up. Something more, elusive, was becoming a part of our meetings, filling every glance, every movement. And I knew I could no longer stop myself. Watching his hand holding the glass, I felt a wave of desire wash over me. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely restrain myself from fleeing the table, so as not to reveal how much this simple, almost familial dinner had become imbued with hidden meanings. The night engulfed the house, leaving it in silence, but inside me boiled a tense resolve. I put on a semi-transparent nightgown, knowing I was doing this intentionally, and headed for the kitchen, sensing Jason was already waiting for me. This time I was ready to go further than ever before. He was standing by the counter, lost in thought, and when he noticed me, he froze, his gaze drifting over me, lingering on every curve. I approached him almost without hesitation, wrapping my arms around his neck and leaning in first. His eyes reflected slight shock, as if taken aback by my initiative, but he responded, drawing me close. His hands rested on my waist, slightly uncertain, as though he was trying to understand how far we would go, but his breath quickened, mirroring the inner impulse he could no longer resist. His lips met mine and a hot wave of tension washed over me, consuming everything. Jason lifted me, and I found myself on the edge of the kitchen counter, pressing closer to him, wrapping my legs around him as he pulled me in with a growing hunger. This moment was ours, forbidden, and it seemed that the whole world had vanished. And suddenly, footsteps, a halted, shocked breath. Standing in the doorway was my mother, her face pale and distorted by horror. Her eyes darted between us, unable to believe what she was seeing, and the air in the room thickened with tension. Jason and I abruptly separated, realizing we had been caught. His hands were still on my waist, but we both froze as though unable to move, facing the reality of what had happened. Mom opened her mouth, barely forcing out words. "What? What are you doing? Tomorrow, we'll talk. Very seriously." Her voice was quiet but full of horror and determination. Her eyes held pain and confusion, and without another word she turned and left, leaving us in this crushing silence. We stood there, bewildered, knowing something irreversible had just happened. The next morning, no one sat down for breakfast. Silence weighed heavily, and even the muffled sounds from the kitchen felt too loud in this tense morning. I waited to be called, and I wasn't wrong. After a while, I heard my mother's voice calling Jason and me into the living room. We entered, trying not to look at each other. Our parents sat opposite us, their faces etched with heavy disappointment. Mom, usually so gentle and understanding, looked at me in a way she never had before, her eyes full of bewilderment and pain. Dad spoke first, his voice firm, though it was clear how hard it was for him to find the words. "Julia, Jason, what happened is unacceptable. We can't justify it. We trusted you, believed you were family, that nothing like this could be between you. How could you do this to us and to yourselves?" His words stabbed like needles, forcing me to feel the full weight of my actions. I couldn't respond, couldn't justify what had happened. A profound sense of guilt spread within me, depriving me of the ability to lift my gaze. Mom continued, her voice trembling as though she herself couldn't believe what she was forced to say. "Julia, I thought you understood how important family is to us, that such things—" She trailed off, unable to find the words, then added softly, almost with tears, "I don't know what to say. How can I ever trust you again?" I struggled to hold back tears, realizing I had betrayed their expectations, destroyed something sacred that was unwavering in our family. But the pain deepened with the realization that this moment was more than just a mistake. It had touched my deepest feelings and desires, from which I couldn't simply walk away. After a long discussion filled with heavy silence and accusations, my father finally uttered what I had feared to hear. "We see no other way. "Jason, you will have to leave. This can't continue, and breaking this connection is only possible this way. You will go to another city, to relatives. The further, the better for all of us." These words, spoken with severe determination, echoed as a hollow ache inside me. We both froze, understanding that this decision was final, that protesting was pointless. Jason nodded silently, accepting the verdict, though I caught a fleeting glimpse of despair in his eyes. His gaze met mine, and in that brief moment, I felt the full weight of our inevitable separation. When our parents left us alone, I remained seated, trying to grasp all that had happened. We had destroyed something that should have been unbreakable, and now I was losing not only Jason but my family's trust. The guilt and pain wrapped around me, leaving me drained. Mark was waiting for me at the door. When I entered, he rose from his chair, his face tense, his expression full of worry and something unforgivably painful. It seemed to take him a lot to keep his composure, but the words he spoke were cold and firm. "We need to talk, Julia. I can't keep going like this. It's like you're not even with me, as if we don't exist. It's like you've gone somewhere, leaving me here alone. I need to know the truth." "What happened?" His questions struck me painfully. I knew I had no excuses, that my actions were inexcusable, but I could no longer hold it all in. Taking a deep breath, I sat across from him, feeling my hands shake, and began quietly. "Mark, I'm sorry. I have to tell you the truth, no matter how harsh it is." He kept his eyes on me, and in his gaze I saw the crumbling of the last hope that everything could be fixed. I gathered all my strength to say the words that were both my confession and my sentence at the same time. Something happened between Jason and me. I don't know how to explain it, and maybe nothing can justify it. But I'm drawn to him so strongly that I can't control my feelings. It's wrong. It's awful, but it's the truth. I've destroyed everything we had. Mark listened in silence, his face turning to stone, and with each word I said, his eyes showed more and more pain. The silence following my confession was deafening. He closed his eyes as if trying to grasp that this wasn't a dream but a cruel reality in which he could no longer be with me. Finally, he stood up, his voice quiet, yet it held the full weight of disappointment. "Do you even realize what you're saying? Do you understand that I loved you, Julia? I thought you did too. But now I see there's nothing left between us." With those words, he turned away, and I felt the sharp sting of his loss consume me. I wanted to say something to try and hold him back, but the words stuck in my throat. He headed to the door and, at the last moment, looked back, his gaze full of bitterness and hurt. "Goodbye, Julia. I hope one day you understand what you've lost." When he left, the door closed, leaving me in silence. I was left alone, and this solitude was more than just an empty house. It was deeper. It was a place my own mistakes had led me to. I had lost everything, my family, my love, my past. And now, standing in that silence, I realized that my connection with Jason had destroyed everything that mattered in my life. The house felt alien. Once filled with the sounds of conversation and laughter, now it was steeped in tense silence. Since morning, I'd been trying to restore even a hint of the previous closeness with my parents, as if one conversation could heal what had been shattered by a single forbidden act. But every conversation now was superficial, fragmented, as if we were speaking through glass, preventing either me or them from reaching each other's hearts. Mom, usually the first to support me in tough moments, now felt almost unreachable. I heard her soft steps in the mornings, saw her setting the table, loading the dishwasher, but her gaze avoided me. She acted as though she was present, but truly wasn't, as if she'd created an invisible boundary around herself. Each time I tried to start a conversation, her responses were short, careful, stripped of the warmth I had been so used to. Her eyes, once full of love, were now filled with pain and exhaustion. I tried to find words to explain, though even I didn't fully understand what had happened, but I knew one thing. I had deeply hurt her. Dad, more restrained and quiet, didn't hide his disappointment. His gaze held no anger, no loud accusations, just a quiet, unshakable bitterness. At one point, walking past me, he said, "Julia, when you grow up, you have to make decisions you're responsible for. We trusted you, believed in you. No one expected that you would do something like this." Those words struck me like a cold wave. I had always known that my parents were proud of me, that they saw me as a role model. Their trust was the foundation of our family's harmony. But now, looking into my father's eyes, I understood that my actions had destroyed that trust, and no words could change it. The next morning came time to say goodbye to Jason. His suitcases were by the door, ready for his departure. We said nothing meaningful to each other. Words couldn't convey what I felt. He stood there, looking at me silently, and in his gaze I saw a mix of bitterness and regret. He, like me, understood that this farewell was inevitable, that there was no other way. "Take care of yourself, Julia," he said softly, his voice sounding distant as if from afar. I nodded, not knowing what to reply. All I could do was watch him leave, feeling that with him went the part of me tied to him. When the door closed behind him, I felt an emptiness, as if someone had pulled out the foundation on which all my feelings stood, leaving me alone. Our meetings, our conversations, our silent glances, all of it now seemed distant, almost unreal. But the consequences, the traces they left, remained, like wounds that would never heal, no matter how much I tried. The entire day I wandered around the house feeling how the emptiness wrapped itself around me tighter and tighter. I tried to keep myself busy, to distract myself, but every action brought me back to the thought that I had destroyed everything dear to me. My parents now felt like strangers, and I was a stranger to them. It was a painful blow from which there was no escape. I was left alone with myself, and my own thoughts became the greatest torment. I thought about what had led me here, how strong, captivating emotions had clouded my mind and led to actions that now seemed incomprehensible. I thought about what once mattered to me, and about how it was now lost. In every room, in every look from my parents, I saw the traces of my mistake. This emptiness, this loneliness, was more than just a separation from my family. It was complete immersion in the realization of my guilt, loss, and that I was the cause of this pain. The last days in the house felt like a silent farewell. Every corner, every room, every look secretly cast at my parents, all were filled with the feeling that the end was near. I knew that the bonds holding us together had been broken. Memories of happy moments seemed distant, almost unreal, and each time I tried to speak to them, the reminder of lost closeness held me back. Mom continued to avoid my gaze, while Dad, even when he tried to be around, could no longer hide his disappointment. I tried to imagine what it must be like for them to see me like this, to stop believing that I was their daughter, the one who always tried to live up to their expectations. Now, that part of life was behind me, and I felt I could no longer stay here. The decision to leave came as a realization that I needed to free myself from this burden and start anew. One night when the house was silent, I sat down at the table to write a letter, the last thing that could express my feelings, for I couldn't find the words in conversation that would convey how deeply sorry I was. "Dear Mom and Dad," I began, feeling how my breath hitched with emotion. "I can't find the words to express how sorry I am. I know I caused you a deep wound that neither words nor actions can heal. I'm not asking for understanding or forgiveness because I know what I've done. All I can say is that this feeling of loss and pain that lives within me will remain with me forever." I paused, pondering what else I could say. Writing the letter was difficult. Each phrase, each word opened up my heart, as if I were reliving those moments that had forever changed our lives. I knew that they would likely never understand why I made such choices, why I allowed myself to be led by feelings that, in essence, destroyed everything we had. I am leaving because I can't stay here, seeing how the pain grows each day. I need to find a new path, perhaps try to understand myself, my mistakes, and learn to live with this burden. I only ask that maybe, one day, after some time has passed, you might be able to look at me not as a source of pain, but as someone who made mistakes but sincerely wanted to regain what was lost. I finished the letter with a trembling hand, unsure how to end my words. Placing the letter on the table, I felt a surge of bitter awareness. This letter was a farewell to the part of life that could no longer be restored. to the relationships that once seemed unbreakable. The next morning, I packed a few things into a small suitcase. My parents didn't ask where I was going, and I offered no explanations. Mom sat in the living room, quietly flipping through a book, but from her look, I understood that she already knew about my decision. Dad stood nearby, avoiding my gaze, as if he didn't want me to see his expression at this moment. When I reached the door, I paused for a moment and took one last look at the house that had been my refuge, my world, and the place where I grew up. Now this place felt foreign, and within me grew a feeling of loss that wouldn't pass, even after I left. Closing the door behind me, I felt a strange relief mixed with pain. My old world was left behind, and now only the path forward lay before me, unknown, full of loneliness. But my new path, which I would have to walk alone, perhaps one day deserving forgiveness and finding myself. The landscape outside the train window changed quickly, as if washing away the memories. The city I was heading to was entirely foreign, with no ties to what I had left behind. My mind was in turmoil with thoughts and memories, but beneath that unease was a barely noticeable hope. A hope that something new awaited me ahead, something I couldn't yet comprehend. The first days in the new place were like a fog. I rented a small room in an old building overlooking a busy street, where every sound felt new, but devoid of memories. Here, there were no shadows that haunted me at home, nothing that reminded me of who I had been before. It seemed that even my footsteps sounded different here, as though I myself had become someone else. I often sat by the window watching unfamiliar passers-by, lost in thoughts of what had brought me here. I knew that my passion for Jason had changed me, not just as a woman but as a person. This passion had been irrational, fleeting, but its intensity had driven me beyond the boundaries of what was acceptable, destroying everything that mattered to me. Yet, despite the pain lingering in my heart, I couldn't reject that experience, couldn't ignore what it had revealed within me. Each night, alone with myself, I rethought my actions, my feelings. What I had experienced with Jason was something that had changed me forever. It had taken away everything I thought was stable and unshakable, but it had also shown me that life has sides that had previously been hidden. I now saw myself differently, complex, imperfect, prone to passions that couldn't be controlled. In this new city, among people for whom I was just a stranger, I felt a strange liberation. I was beginning to learn how to build my world anew, step by step, finding the strength to keep living, despite everything that had happened. I didn't know if I would ever regain my parents' trust, find forgiveness for everything I had destroyed. But here, far from the past, I had a chance to understand myself and realize what kind of person I needed to become. Sitting on a bench in a city park on one of the cool evenings, I took a deep breath and closed my eyes. Inside, it still hurt, but it was a pain I was learning to accept as a part of myself. I knew this journey would be long and difficult, but I was ready to walk it. Now, in this new city with a blank slate, I was ready to begin again.